commitments to make the reforms for smart spending cuts. But we also need Republicans to adopt the same approach to tax reform that Speaker Boehner championed just 2 months ago.
The President says we have to have another tax increase in order to avoid the sequester. Well, Mr. President, you got your tax increase. It's time to cut spending here in Washington.
I don't understand this debate. I don't understand the Republican position on the sequester. And I don't mean the politics and the polls of it. We already talked about how the polling doesn't seem to look so good for the Republicans. What matters more than that, what is really, I think, puzzling here is their underlying position, the policy, doesn't make a lot of sense given their budget goals. As I understand it, Republicans have 5 basic goals in the budget talks and have for some time now. Number 1, they say, is cut the deficit. Number 2, cut entitlement spending. Number 3, protect defense spending and possibly even increase it. 4 is simplify the tax code by cleaning out deductions and cleaning out loopholes. And 5 is always, of course, lower tax rates. Now, the White House is willing to cut a deal with Republicans that will accomplish goals 1, 2, 3, and 4. It won't lower tax rates, but it'll do all the other things. But Republicans won't entertain that deal. They're saying, no, we prefer the sequester to goals 1 through 4. And so that means instead the sequester will happen, our Republicans will get less deficit reduction than they would get in a larger deal. They won't touch entitlement spending really at all. They will see defense spending get an incredibly deep cut. They'll get no cleaning of the tax code and, of course, no tax cut. So rather than striking a deal with the White House and accomplishing 4 of their 5, they're accomplishing part of one, and badly hurting another for a net 0. So what exactly is a Republican policy strategy here? What am I missing? Here to answer that is Ben Domenech, a co-founder of Red State and editor of the excellent conservative morning newsletter, The Transom. Ben, thank you for joining me.
Great to be with you.
What am I missing?
I think what you're missing is a number, and I think that number is 158, which is the number of House Republicans who've shown up since 2006 out of 232 today. And of those Republicans, I think if you look at what is priority for them, their priority list actually doesn't really include that number 3 on your list. It doesn't include protecting defense spending, which I think goes back to the miscalculation that the White House made, that the President made when this whole process started, which was an assumption, I think, founded reasonably on the actions that came in the previous decade from a lot of the Republicans who currently occupy leadership, which is basically those Republicans who are interested in defending defense spending, who have been, preaching, for the past several years how much it was important to protect that, to isolate it away from any cuts. And those Republicans, while they still occupy the leadership and they still hold positions of power in Washington, don't necessarily represent the interests of the base, for whom the fiscal crisis, for whom the financial crisis is really the equivalent of their 9/11 now, is really the single moment that really affects all of the ways that they analyze policy today.
I buy that the new generation of Republicans who doesn't care that much about defense spending. I think you're right about that. But going back then to the sequester,
sure,
that still leaves 1, 2, and 4. And there's no doubt that you can get more deficit reduction, more total money shaved off of the deficit if you go for the bigger deal, if you include tax increases. I mean, there's no doubt that the two sides could come together on more money. The president's offer currently, I believe, is about $1.8 trillion, which is significantly larger than what's in the sequester alone. And then second to that, they also believe very strongly that the key here is entitlement spending. Not all spending is created equal, that it's Medicare spending, Medicaid spending, Social Security spending. The White House would be willing to get into those programs, but they are not without going outside of the boundaries of the sequester. So what about the rest of that?
I think the problem with that is that you have to have an assumption of confidence on the part of these the conservative base of Republicans as a whole, that when it comes time to negotiate with the White House, they'll come out with a better deal. And I think that frankly, the base now believes that Republicans are incapable of doing such a thing. After the experience with the fiscal cliff and everything that came before, they have their doubts about the ability of Republicans to negotiate any better situation. And I think that the second part of that is there's really a skepticism, I think, on the part of the base right now about the willingness of Republicans to cut in any real sense. And any negotiation that backs off from the sequester would, I think, be read as a retreat from cuts, a retreat from, really being willing to reduce the size and scope of government. And I think that because of that, there's an unwillingness on the part of conservatives, both in the House and leadership among the Republican Party, to do anything along those lines, because that will be sold as a retreat from any willingness on their part to really be fiscally conservative. And we saw the effect that that had on their brand over the course of the previous decade under George W. Bush. It really, laid the seeds for everything that came in the form of the Tea Party.
But was it what happened in the course of the previous decade that they made a bunch of decisions around spending that, because they wouldn't touch taxes, blew up the deficit? I mean, that was at least part of what happens in that narrative. But
sure.
but beneath that, I think, is this other question that when they're looking at a deal like this, when they're saying, we don't believe that our leadership can come to a better deal, they don't have to undo the sequester until the deal is done. It just seems to me that underneath all this is this weird decision to treat all spending in the tax code as a tax increase and not be willing to break this pledge.
But Ezra, is your problem with it that the sequester exists, or is it just that the cuts aren't smart enough? I think that from the perspective of a lot of the conservative base, they don't buy this distinction between smart cuts and dumb cuts that is very important here within Washington.
Really?
I don't think that they see that as being all that critical, especially when it's sort of the question of, is the world going to collapse if we rewind to what government spending was at the beginning of the month? I think that it's more along the lines of a conversation between leadership in the Republican Party and their conservative base, understanding that if they retreat in any way, if they're viewed as retreating in any way from holding the line on spending cuts of this nature, even if they are stupid in the parlance of Washington, then I think that they'll be viewed as being cowardly on one of the few issues that they still can go back to their base and say, we can actually speak with some authority on this because we don't want government to be as big as the president does.
If you are right that the House Republicans basically no longer believe in the difference between smart and dumb spending cuts, that is, I think, the scariest thing I've heard in the debate. Ben Domenech, thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Pleasure to be with you.
Remember this guy?